The courtiers whispered a single name behind closed doors: El Hechizado, the Bewitched One. It was the nickname of a king and a curse. In the late 17th century, the Spanish Empire stood like a wounded beast, its glory fading, its people starving, and its rulers clinging desperately to a dying dream of divine power. Once, Spain had ruled half the known world. From the silver mines of the Americas to the burning sands of North Africa, its reach was unmatched. But by the time Charles II took the throne, the empire was crumbling, and so was its king. This wasn't just the story of one man's tragedy. This was the slow death of a dynasty undone, not by swords or invaders, but by something far stranger: blood itself. The Spanish Habsburgs had ruled for centuries, bound by a single obsession: purity. They believed their power came from God, and their bloodline carried that divine right. The courtiers whispered a single name behind closed doors: El Hechizado, the Bewitched One. It was the nickname of a king and a curse. By the time Charles II was born in 1661, his family's experiment had reached its breaking point. He was the living proof that the empire's greatest strength had become its greatest curse. Even as an infant, rumors spread through the palace. Servants said the baby's head was too large for his tiny body, his jaw protruded unnaturally, his tongue too heavy for speech. Some believed he had been touched by demons. Others whispered of witchcraft. But the truth was both simpler and far more horrifying. Charles's very existence carried the weight of 2 centuries of calculated marriages. He was the son of Philip IV of Spain and his own niece, Mariana of Austria. On paper, it was a union meant to secure power across Europe. In reality, it was a genetic trap. Historians today know Charles had one of the most extreme cases of inbreeding in royal history. His parents were more closely related than half-siblings. The result? A boy born into unimaginable fragility. And yet, at just 4 years old, Charles became king. A child with the body of a ghost and the weight of an empire collapsing around him. Spain expected him to lead, but Charles could barely walk. He struggled to speak. He had fits of illness that terrified his caretakers and bewildered the court physicians. While kings across Europe commanded armies and negotiated treaties, Spain's bewitched king was often kept hidden from his own people. The royal portraits showed him as strong and noble, but the reality was very different. Behind palace walls, the boy, king's body was failing, and his mind was unraveling. Still, the Spanish court clung to its rituals and its pride. They whispered prayers, they sought blessings. Some believed only divine intervention could save him. But as Charles grew older, it became clear that this wasn't a curse from witches or demons. It was the curse of the Habsburg blood, a dynasty slowly collapsing under the weight of its own ambitions. And yet, this was only the beginning, because Charles's life would spiral into something far darker than anyone could imagine. The bewitched king was destined to become the center of scandals, exorcisms, betrayals, and death, and the empire he inherited would bleed alongside him. Before Charles II ever drew his first breath, his fate had already been sealed, not by prophecy, not by demons, but by 200 years of calculated marriages, a royal obsession with purity that slowly poisoned an empire. For the Spanish Habsburgs, the bloodline wasn't just family, it was power. They believed their right to rule came directly from God, and therefore their blood must remain untainted. Any dilution, any marriage to outsiders risked weakening the divine favor they believed set them apart from ordinary mortals. And so, generation after generation, they chose each other. Cousins wed cousins. Uncles married nieces. Even half-siblings joined in holy matrimony under the banner of God and empire. What began as strategy became catastrophe. By the time Charles was born in 1661, his family tree wasn't a tree anymore. It was a circle. His father, Philip IV, had married his own niece Mariana of Austria. On paper, it was meant to strengthen alliances within the empire. In reality, it meant that Charles's parents were more closely related than half-siblings. Geneticists today estimate that Charles II inherited so little new DNA that his biological diversity was equivalent to being born from incest between a brother and sister. It was a slow-motion disaster, one meticulously crafted over centuries by the people, meant to prevent it, and the results were written on Charles's face. The Habsburg jaw, or mandibular prognathism, had haunted his dynasty for generations, but in Charles, it reached its grotesque extreme. His lower jaw jutted forward so far that his teeth couldn't meet. making chewing nearly impossible. Meals became public humiliations. Servants would cut his food into tiny pieces. Courtiers would look away as the king, the most powerful man in Spain, drooled into his plate. The royal portraits lied, painting him as dignified and strong, but eyewitnesses recorded the truth. He struggled to swallow. He mumbled words no one could understand. Even at banquets, his deformities became court gossip, whispered in candlelit halls. But the physical deformities were only part of the tragedy. The same inbreeding that twisted his jaw also weakened his body and mind. Charles suffered from constant illness, fevers, seizures, and mysterious fits that terrified his caretakers. Some nights, they feared he wouldn't wake up. And yet, when he survived, the whispers grew louder. The boy is bewitched. Because in a deeply religious Spain, there had to be an explanation, a reason the king could not speak clearly, could not walk properly, could not be normal. The priest said demons had cursed him. The doctors said his humors were unbalanced, but no one dared say the truth aloud. The Spanish Empire had engineered its own destruction. And perhaps the cruelest cut of all, Charles knew. Even as a child, he was aware that he was different. The looks, the whispers, the carefully staged portraits hiding his disfigurements. He grew up in a palace where every corridor echoed with pity disguised as reverence. By the time he was a teenager, Charles already believed what others dared not say, that he was broken. A king in name only. A boy born to rule an empire, but never to survive it. From the moment Charles II entered the world on the 6th of November 1661, the whispers began. The midwives exchanged silent looks. The priests clutched their rosaries. The newborn king didn't cry. In the great palaces of Spain, the royal doctors assured the court that the infant was healthy. But behind closed doors, they saw the truth. This was a body nature never intended to build. By the time Charles was 3, his deformities were undeniable. He had a head far too large for his body, a swollen dome balanced on a frail, crooked neck. His limbs were thin and brittle, his chest collapsed inward, and his hunched back made him appear decades older than his age. Even the portrait's carefully staged propaganda couldn't fully disguise it. Artists softened his jawline, slimmed his face, straightened his posture. But in private, eyewitnesses described something far more unsettling. The king walks as though his bones cannot hold him. His gaze is vacant, as if his spirit drifts elsewhere. This was no ordinary frailty. This was centuries of inbreeding made flesh. At an age when other children were chasing dogs through palace gardens, Charles still lay confined to his chambers. He could not walk until he was 8 years old. And even then, his steps were shaky, unnatural, as though his body resisted the command to move forward. Speaking came no easier. He struggled to form words, often stammering incomprehensibly, his jaw too malformed to produce clear speech. Courtiers would lean in, nodding, pretending to understand their king, but later, behind closed doors, they laughed or prayed. The Spanish court lived under strict ritual. Whenever Charles entered a room, everyone smiled. They bowed deeply, their voices dripping with reverence. "Your Majesty, divine gift of God." But their eyes betrayed them. Behind every forced grin was pity and fear. Servants whispered of curses. Priests muttered that God was punishing Spain for its sins. Foreign ambassadors reported home with quiet horror. The king is not fit to rule. He is but a child in a man's body. Charles was not the first monarch whose body betrayed him. History remembered Richard III of England, whose twisted spine made him a villain in Shakespeare's quill. But Richard ruled fiercely despite his deformities. Charles was different. Where Richard fought, Charles collapsed. His frailty wasn't just physical, it ran deeper, into his blood, his mind, his very identity. Unlike other kings born with defects, Charles's entire existence seemed to unravel from within. And this, the grotesque body, the endless humiliation, was only the beginning. Because Charles II carried more than broken bones. Inside his skull was a mind struggling to hold itself together. Nightmares plagued him. He heard whispers no one else heard. At times, he stared into empty corners for minutes, as if seeing something others couldn't. The court called him El Hechizado, the bewitched one. And as the years went on, it became clear that the greatest tragedy wasn't his twisted body. It was the slow, inevitable collapse of his mind. The bells of Madrid rang for a king. But behind the towering palace walls, Spain's ruler was little more than a terrified child in a man's body. By the time Charles II turned 10 years old, it was clear to everyone the boy was not like other kings. He struggled to read, couldn't follow the simplest discussions of policy, and often became confused by ceremonies designed for him. Yet, whenever courtiers tried to explain affairs of state, his attention would drift. Sometimes, he would laugh without reason. Other times, he would explode into uncontrollable fits of rage. This was not a sovereign, this was a prisoner inside his own skull. The royal tutors worked tirelessly, trying to mold Charles into something resembling a monarch. They taught him Latin, theology, and military history, or at least, they tried. But Charles couldn't focus. He would stare at his books for hours, tracing the shapes of letters with his fingers, unable to retain meaning. One frustrated tutor recorded in a private diary, "His Majesty can recite prayers by memory, but he does not understand their words." Another ambassador, sent from France, described the young king as possessing the mind of a child of 5, a damning report that spread through European courts like wildfire. Charles's limitations might have been hidden if not for his tantrums. When confused, he would scream until his throat gave out. When contradicted, he would throw plates, overturn furniture, even bite his own hands in frustration. At other times, the opposite happened. He would withdraw completely, sitting for hours in silence, refusing food, refusing speech, as if trapped in some private nightmare. These violent swings terrified his courtiers. The palace staff learned to move quietly, speaking only when spoken to, careful never to provoke the king's unpredictable moods. Inside the marble halls of the Alcazar, gossip festered like an open wound. Priests whispered of curses, servants spoke of witchcraft. Foreign envoys sent chilling letters back home. One Venetian diplomat warned, "The king is fragile of body and feeble of mind. Spain's throne trembles under the weight of his weakness." Another observer noted that Charles would often stop mid-conversation, eyes wide and unblinking, staring into the distance, as though listening to voices only he could hear. Some called him cursed. Others called him bewitched. But a darker thought began to spread among the courtiers. Perhaps God himself had abandoned Spain. By the mid-1670 seconds, Spain's empire, once the most powerful on earth, was rotting from the inside out. The economy collapsed. The army starved. Foreign powers circled like vultures, sensing blood in the water. And at the center of it all was Charles II, the man they called El Hechizado, the bewitched one. Among peasants and nobles alike, a chilling belief took hold. The king himself was a bad omen, a walking curse, the embodiment of God's wrath against a dynasty that had defied the laws of nature. Even his own advisors debated in secret whether Spain could survive his reign at all. As the court spiraled into paranoia, Spain's government fractured, factions formed, each vying to control the fragile king, the queen regent, the clergy, the ambitious nobles, and the Inquisition itself. Charles was a puppet, his trembling hands holding a scepter too heavy for him to lift. And behind the curtains, the real war had already begun, a war for the soul of Spain, while its king wandered the palace halls, lost inside his own mind. By the late 1670 seconds, Spain's royal court was consumed by one singular, desperate obsession. The king must produce an heir. Without one, the empire already weakened and fractured would fall into chaos. But there was a terrible problem. Charles II, El Hechizado, couldn't do it. In 1679, at just 18 years old, Charles married Marie Louise of Orléans, a radiant French princess and niece of King Louis XIV. For her, the journey from Versailles to Madrid felt like a descent into a darker world. The Spanish court was oppressive, cold, and suffocating, filled with priests, spies, and whispered omens about her new husband. When Marie Louise first met Charles, she was polite, smiling, and dutiful. But behind closed doors, she wrote tearful letters home, describing her shock. "The king is feeble in body and troubled in mind. He is more a child than a man." Her role was clear: produce an heir or be discarded. But nights passed, then months, then years, and the royal marriage bed remained tragically silent. At first, courtiers blamed Marie Louise, whispering that she was too cold, too distant, perhaps even bewitched. But physicians soon began examining the king himself. The humiliations Charles endured were endless. He was subjected to invasive fertility tests, strange herbal remedies, and whispered prayers from priests who suspected demonic interference. Doctors prescribed elixirs made of bull's testicles, ground-up gemstones, and exotic aphrodisiacs imported from the Americas. Nothing worked. Ambassadors across Europe reported the scandal in coded letters. A French envoy wrote bluntly, His Majesty is incapable of the act required to produce heirs.